before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official FindJodi Podcast. Welcome back to the FindJodi Podcast. I'm Scott Fuller, and thank you for listening. It's been a while since our last episode, so we wanted to, before we get into this conversation, provide you with a bit of an update from the team on what we've been working on. We're currently working on some longer-term projects related to the investigation that we hope to be able to tell you more about at some point. But as it relates to the podcast, the team and I have been busy producing the first of a series of episodes delving into the people that police have looked into in Jodi's case over the years. And in other episodes to come in 2021, we'll also be examining Jodi's case through our investigations, the investigations of the FindJodi team, as some of those leads were dead ends, and some still haven't been fully worked out yet. And we think you may be interested also in just the details of how FindJodi carries out its work, and frankly, just some of the amazing stories that we'll be able to share from the last 15 years. So all that is in the plans for episodes for the podcast in 2021. But then again, this case has a way of directing things on its own sometimes. And today's topic is a good example of that. 1 year ago, Michelle Martinko was a name that didn't have any connection at all to Jodi Huisentruit's case. But that changed earlier this year when video of Michelle's convicted killer, a man named Jodi Burns, was played at his trial in court. And the video showed Burns talking about Jodi Huisentruit, of all people, while being questioned by police about the death of Michelle Martinko, also a young, attractive, blonde woman. This is the audio of the video that aired earlier this year at Jodi Burns' murder trial that caused all the interest among those who follow the Jodi Huisentruit case. To set the scene, two Cedar Rapids police detectives are walking into Jodi Burns' shop 39 years after the death of Michelle Martinko, and they're armed with the information that his DNA, Jodi Burns' DNA, was found in blood at the scene of Michelle Martinko's death in 1979. Obviously, he is not aware of that. That's their trump card that they're going to play, but they're going to open up the conversation very casually. And one of their first questions is, has Jodi Burns ever heard of the Michelle Martinko case? Does he remember seeing it in coverage in media? And without prompting, Burns brings up Jodi Huisentruit.
Be all right if we just ask you a few questions about it. So this happened in December of 1979, and you said earlier that you kind of heard about it. What do you remember hearing about it?
Just it was a big deal.
A big deal. I mean, do you remember what happened?
Not exactly.
Like, do you remember who the victim was, anything like that?
Not really, but
had you ever...
No, I just seen something about Jodi Huisentruit recently. And,
yeah. That's a similar kind of thing or whatever with the girl. But had you ever heard of Michelle Martinko before this case came out? Had you ever seen her picture in the paper or anything like that?
A long time ago.
Many of you, after that video aired, wrote or called us, and the team was also interested in that development as well. But like Jodi's case, Michelle Martinko's was very cold. She lost her life as an 18-year-old high school student in 1979. And her case was recently featured on an episode of CBS's 48 Hours, which has also chronicled Jodi's case in recent years. And 48 Hours decided to spend some of its coverage examining a possible connection between Michelle Martinko's killer, Jodi Burns, and Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance from Mason City in 1995. And so today we will do just that as well. FindJodi team member Caroline Lowe recently interviewed Cedar Rapids, Iowa detective Matt Demlinger, who is the lead investigator on the Michelle Martinko case. You'll hear that conversation coming up next. First, some background. Michelle Martinko was found murdered inside a car in a mall parking lot in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, December 19, 1979. The case had a few leads initially. One of Michelle's ex-boyfriends for a long time was suspected of playing some part in her death. There were other suspects over the years as well, but long story short, the case quickly went cold and stayed that way. From 1979 until 2005, when police found what they thought was the killer's blood from evidence collected at the scene of the murder. From that blood, a DNA profile was extracted. But the DNA profile didn't match any others in any database, and so for 10 years, police had the killer's blood, but didn't know who it belonged to, and so couldn't identify Michelle's killer. But in those 10 years, genetic investigative tools exponentially increased, and one technique in particular would prove essential to finally closing the Michelle Martinko homicide. Here is Caroline Lowe's interview with Cedar Rapids detective Matt Denlinger, lead investigator on the Michelle Martinko case.
Well, in the Martinko case, the DNA was literally everything. Up until the advent of DNA technology, we had not developed any substantial lead that would have ever directed us to suspect Jerry Burns. So the DNA was really critical in reopening the case and giving us new avenues to search and look for the suspect. I would say that in this particular case, we were really blessed to have found DNA, and we were really, really blessed that the officers that originally processed the scene, Dick White and the other Cedar Rapids police officers, they processed the scene in a very meticulous way to preserve that evidence, even though they weren't even aware we were going to need it. And then to preserve it for that many years at the Cedar Rapids Police Department really helped in the long run. So you have to kind of think about those things going in now, but it was really nice that they were thinking about blood even in 1979 in terms of blood typing.
And that blood evidence was obtained from the victim's dress, if you could describe where it was found.
In this particular case, the blood evidence that we found that had the suspect DNA was found on the gear shift in the victim's vehicle, and it was also found on the victim's dress. So it was a partial profile was developed in the late 90s, so almost 20 years later, from the gear shift selector, from some blood scrapings from the gear shift selector. But it wasn't until 2005, so like 26 years later, that a full male DNA profile was found on the victim's dress.
Without DNA, if you had not obtained that DNA that led you to Jerry Burns, where would you be today based on what else you had at the scene? Where do you think you'd be today without the DNA evidence?
I'm not sure we'd be any further along than we were in the mid-'80s. I think we'd still be interviewing people. We maybe would still be circling around the same core group of suspects that they had during the 80s. I'm not sure we would have came up with another way to reach far enough until we found our suspect.
So it was the key break. It was huge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's undeniable that the DNA was really the evidence that had to be found for this case to be solved.
If we could just sort of pivot now to Jodi Huisentruit's case. I know you weren't involved in it, but have not been involved. But if you could describe how Jodi's name came up during the course of the Martinko investigation. It wasn't something you were looking for in any way, as I understand.
So that's kind of a popular question I've gotten since my interview with Jerry became public during the court proceedings. The popular question is, why did he bring up Jodi Huisentruit? And I think that at the time, Jodi's case was fresh in the media, as it typically is here in Iowa. But my perception of why he brought it up was that he was just thinking of nervous things to discuss during our interview to avoid having to talk about the topic we were trying to focus on, which was Michelle Martinko.
So just an excited utterance kind of thing, a nervous pattern.
Yeah, something of that nature. I think he was trying to appear calm and appear that he just wanted to, be open to talking to me, but he really didn't want to talk about Michelle's case.
Did you find anything during the Martinko investigation that could show any possible connection between Jodi Huisentruit and Jerry Burns? Anything at all that surfaced beyond his quote, his comment that day during the questioning?
Nothing at all.
Any connection to Mason City that developed as you did the background on him?
No, we didn't develop any connection with Mason City or any other homicide cases for that matter.
So when people hear this now about Jodi and his name, where would you frame the likelihood of any kind of involvement based on what you know?
From my knowledge of Jerry and from what little knowledge I have of Jodi's case in particular, I would say there's very little likelihood that there's any connection at all between Jerry and Jodi Huisentruit.
What were some of the similarities and differences between the two cases? We often hear about both, young blonde women at their car. You could just describe things that were similar, but the real differences from what you understand.
Well, I think one of the common similarities that people see when they read newspaper clippings or see little news highlights is that both of them were relatively young, attractive, blonde females, and I think that they find it easy to kind of categorize those as being significant. But the things that separate the case would be that I would classify Michelle's homicide as sort of a stranger homicide. So there would be no connection between the suspect and the victim prior to the homicide, and she was not specifically targeted prior to the event happening. Whereas in Jodi Huisentruit's case, I think some of the evidence that, as I understand it, would lead you to believe that this person had some prior contact or maybe even some prior knowledge of her behaviors, her patterns. They may have been acquainted with her prior to the attack. It sounds like she was attacked outside of her residence before she went to work in the morning. And I think someone would need to know her pattern, know where she lives. And so I just think it seems less likely that person's a total stranger. And in Michelle's case, I think it's quite likely that Jerry and Michelle had no prior knowledge of each other. My opinion is that Jerry was not looking for Michelle in particular. He was looking for someone that met his criteria. So maybe a younger female that was by themselves. And I think he probably selected Westdale Mall around Christmas time because he knew that was going to be a heavily populated location with lots of potential targets. And so I like to think of it as, he went fishing at a pond where he knew there was going to be a lot of fish, as opposed to, just going someplace random.
And when you look at Jodi's situation, that even though you're not involved in the case from the outside, that does not look random to you. Someone shopping in the parking lot, if you will, at 4:30 in the morning.
Right. At 4:30 in the morning, whatever time it was, I don't think a small apartment complex is the best place to just try to find someone at random walking. So that's the primary piece of evidence that I think speaks to that being more personal and less random.
Has Jerry Burns' DNA, as far as you know, been linked to any other cases that you're aware of?
No, not to my knowledge.
You are quoted in some of the media saying that your hunch, your gut, if I'm using the correct words, was he's likely to have other victims. So do you still feel that way, or is that just sort of based on what he did in a random case like this?
Yeah, no, I would say that I still feel like that's a possibility. And I wish there were some evidence to point to which other cases in particular, but I think after this long, with the absence of DNA, it's going to be near impossible to directly tie him to anything else.
Did Mason City Police reach out to you as well, after the break and after the mention of Jodi Huisentruit in that interview?
Yeah, I spoke to the Mason City Police Department about their case, a little bit about our case. We spoke about technology and a little bit about, his comment. And I think we came to the same conclusion that we agreed that there's a very slim likelihood that Jerry had any connection at all to their case.
Any lessons learned from a break in almost 40 years? You've been an investigator many years. I understand your father was a longtime detective. Any takeaway lessons from this case that you might share with others?
I think with any case, one of the things that you should always be willing to do is let another set of eyes take a look at the case. Mm-hmm. And that's the break that we got in our case. We, late 90s, early 2000s, Detective Larison really put another set of eyes on this thing and came up with a new game plan for it. And that really got the ball rolling again. And then I feel like by the time I came along, I was able to put another set of eyes on it in addition to what Doug had already done. And, we made another leap forward with the genetic genealogy. So I think to periodically just take another fresh look at it, maybe a new investigator, can always be helpful in a case. It doesn't have to be me. In this case, I think the biggest break we had was, under, Doug's leadership.
And your wife played a role.
I purchased my wife an Ancestry.com DNA test kit so she could send that in and find a little more about her ethnicity. And what she did is she sent it in and got the results back and included a small little map of the world and, kind of a breakdown of her ethnic breakdown. And it was at that time that she suggested to me that, wouldn't that be neat if you could do that with your Martinko case? And that was our light bulb moment. That got the ball rolling to investigate DNA technology and labs and different places that we could try this.
And one of the things you mentioned, too, is the DNA helped rule somebody out who had been on your radar, the police radar for many years, the former boyfriend. Can you tell us how his role and how that played a role not just to include but to exclude somebody?
Well, right. So Michelle's, one of Michelle's more recent boyfriends was at the mall that night and had a lot of contact with her. And he was looked at long and hard as a potential suspect for this because he had been at the mall and because they had broken up sort of in the recent history for 40 years. We could never really eliminate him as a suspect, or for I guess it would have been more like 25 years until we eliminated him in the mid 2000s. But it was one of those things that, no matter how much you believe in the alibi, no matter how much, how little evidence there was to really, point to him doing it, you always had it in the back of your mind. It's not until he's actually eliminated by collecting DNA right from his mouth that you can kind of step back and say, okay, let's just ignore him now and let's move on.
And he cooperated. He's provide a swab for you.
Correct. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He wanted to help us any way he could. He did not want to be under that umbrella of suspicion any longer.
What do you, looking back at that, is there any takeaway to learn from how somebody can be the wrong person all those years?
With new cases, it's really easy to start immediately looking at one or two people. And you have to think in the back of your head, let's not get such tunnel vision here that we miss something on this case. And so we really try to be open-minded to all possibilities and not get that tunnel vision. And I think, it's tragic that he had to live like that for his whole life of people believing that it was him. I think there was people that probably believed it was him even after we eliminated him. But until we arrested Jerry, I think people thought he was still under our microscope.
And my sense from talking to you earlier is it was meaningful to you to be able to clear him with the DNA, be able to have that part of the case, not just to point at who did do it, but be able to clear somebody who'd had this cloud over his head.
Yeah, not just him too. There's quite a few people that were happy to be eliminated. She had other boyfriends and other friends, teachers, people in the kind of the close in on the circle of interest in this particular case, and it was nice. I had the luxury of taking over the case after a lot of these really obvious suspects were already eliminated. You could call it somewhat of a luxury in that I didn't have to worry about them, but it was a little bit of a headache too, because now I had to come up with new people on my own to figure out who could it be.
So you could push the others aside, but the case still wasn't solved. If you were assigned Jodi's case today, where do you think you'd start investigating, given what you've learned from Michelle's case and others as an experienced investigator?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything I can think of that they haven't already done, but given the fact that I'm not as familiar with that case, I would probably start by pulling all the evidence out and then just taking a hard look at it and thinking to myself, is there anything here that we could do more with that hasn't already been done? Maybe we could have something tested a second or third time. In the Martinko case, her dress had to be tested, 4 or 5 times before we found the suspect DNA. So maybe be open-minded to that.
And in Jodi's case, there were items, I think you're aware, like her blow dryer, shoes that were tossed in the parking lot. Are those things that could lend themselves to be touched, or be tested?
Yeah. Those are all things that you could have tested. I don't know I don't know the circumstances of how those things were collected or exactly what items were collected. But I think it's not crazy to think that anything she had in her hands was touched by a suspect. Whether or not they had gloves on, I don't know. Or maybe they could have had prior contact with those items. I don't know that either. But unfortunately, I'm a little DNA leaning at this point since I've had some success with it. So that would be one avenue that I would probably consider.
Sure. They did say publicly that they lifted a partial palm print. Is that something that automatically would go through? I mean, if Burns were processed, he would have supplied a print that could have been compared.
Right. Well, the problem with a partial palm print or a partial print of any sort is that those don't automatically get a hit when compared to other. They take the trained eye of a fingerprint expert to compare those, and it's probably something where you'll need to pull, Jerry's prints and compare them directly to whatever print you have there. It's probably not going to hit just off of the fingerprint database.
And it also gets the quality of whatever was collected at the time. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would certainly, the quality of the print or how complete or how partial it is would certainly affect, the ability for the computers to recognize a match.
Anything else you can think of that stands out about from your case and Jodi's case for our audiences primarily?
One of the things that I also did in my case is I went back to some of the people that had already been interviewed, and rather than rely on the first investigator's documentation of their interview with that person, I redid some interviews, including some witness interviews, and I found that it's pretty refreshing to speak to some of these people. I was able to retrace some of Michelle's last moments in a little more detail than they were originally documented in the reports, which was beneficial.
That's even with people's memories almost 4 decades old? They were able to do that.
Right. So even with their memory 4 decades old, I was able to get a little more information from a couple of witnesses that really made their original report stand out to me. Made things that I was originally confused about just that much more clear.
There was clarification in the follow-up interviews?
Yes, there was clarification in several follow-up interviews that I found quite helpful.
Anything else before I let you go? And I really appreciate your insight in helping us, because we're hoping one of these days to have answers in Jodi's case. It'll be 26 years in June for her.
I would love for that case to have a breakthrough that those investigators could run with. And so I got my fingers crossed like everyone else. I think with technology changing so rapidly, I would say just don't give up hope.
Any suggestion for the media, roles you feel the media can do to help with a case like this? Did it make any difference in Michelle's case, Martinko's case?
Keep it in the forefront. In our particular case, we had a couple press releases that we needed the media to help us generate some more conversation about some of the new evidence we had. So any new evidence that you could share with the media that people could think back on that time in their life, I think it is useful to share it with the public, because ultimately, in a lot of cases, you're going to need the public's help to solve it.
But I think a lot of departments feel that if you share information, you're going to jeopardize something. Clearly you don't want things that only the killer knows, but there seems to be a propensity to be afraid of releasing details to not want to harm the case.
I see both sides of that. That is a really accurate perception of things. It is a really prominent opinion that you can't share too much, almost nothing with the public or with the media because you want to protect the integrity of your case. And I think it is always good to save a few things that you will always have in your back pocket. But then, I'm kind of the opinion that it's also helpful to share some things too. So I think there is a happy medium there, and everyone needs to figure out where that is in their particular case.
In February 2020, Jerry Burns was convicted of killing Michelle Martinko 40 years before. He was sentenced to life without parole. He has maintained his innocence and has begun the appeals process. Why did he mention Jodi's name when questioned by police? This is worthy of note. Burns was questioned by police in his office about the Martinko case on December 19th, 2018. That was only 4 days after the 48 Hours episode entitled Find Jodi, covering Jodi Huisentruit's case, aired nationally.
I just seen something about Jodi Huisentruit recently.
Yeah.
And it just might be that simple. Jerry Burns had just seen something about Jodi Huisentruit on television. The entire Find Jodi team would like to thank Cedar Rapids detective Matt Denlinger for his time and his fresh perspective on the Jodi case. His work on the Michelle Martinko case does go to show that even after nearly 4 decades, there can be reason to hope for answers in even the coldest cases. For the entire Find Jodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.